Hello, this is Benjamin Boyce. Welcome to my channel. I wanted to read you guys a series of tweets by this teacher from the Science Leadership Academy in Philadelphia. His name is Matthew R.K., and he wrote some things on Twitter that got him in a little bit of hot water. Kind of fascinating stuff, and it kind of gives us a window into what certain public servants, being school teachers, think about trying to teach students certain things when the students aren't in their care, but rather in the student's home. This is what Matthew R.K. wrote, and this was published at 8:30 a.m. on the 8th of August, which is yesterday from my position in this particular timeline. He wrote, "So this fall, virtual class discussions will have many potential spectators, parents, siblings, etc., in the same room. We will never be quite sure who is overhearing the discourse. What does this do for our equity inclusion work?" Thread. "How much have students depended on the somewhat secure barriers of our physical classrooms to encourage vulnerability? How many of us have installed some version of what happens here stays here to help this? To help what? To help the students be vulnerable. Vulnerable towards what? Towards equity and inclusion work." He continues, "While conversations about race are in my wheelhouse and remain a concern in this no-walls environment, I am most intrigued by the damage that helicopter snowplow parents can do in honest conversations about gender, sexuality. And while conservative parents are my chief concern, I know that the damage can come from the left too. If we are engaged in the messy work of destabilizing a kid's racism or homophobia or transphobia, how much do we want their classmates' parents piling on?" So I thought that this was pretty off the charts disturbing for me, and I shared it and other people shared it. This guy has made his tweets kind of private, and I went on a little bit of a hunt to kind of understand him a little bit more, because I don't want to read the worst into him. I think he naively thinks that he's working for justice, but he's also shedding some light on what public teachers think their job is. And I think it's overreach, and I think it's overstep, and I think that we are in a particular time when parents can actually see what the teachers are doing to the children, and then to question those things and rein the teachers in, and the teachers are getting defensive because they are on this quest for justice. Not that justice is wrong, but neither that their methods are right. So I found this excerpt from a book that he wrote, and the book was called Not Light, but Fire: How to Lead Meaningful Race Conversations in the Classroom. And this will be linked down in the description below. He talks about how he was running this poetry workshop after class, and in 2014, the students were talking about what was happening in Ferguson with the riots and the death of Michael Brown, who actually, I believe, happened 6 years ago today, from my perspective in this particular timeline. And they the students and him started talking about what it is like to be white in this conversation, what it is to be black in this conversation, and what it is to have a white teacher talk to you this way about it as a black person, and so on and so forth. And they were talking about kind of the niceties of this conversation. And then he writes, "This debate," I told them, being the students, "made me think of something. When I was growing up, my parents used the term house talk to label conversations that I was not to share with anyone else. This term implied that people outside of our family wouldn't understand, and involving them would annoyingly complicate things or cause actual trouble. I asked this latter group of student poets if they felt that race conversations were better kept as house talk. When they agreed, I asked them to explain. And then he talks about how a white girl felt that she was tripping over her words, didn't know what to say, because everything that she could possibly say would be misinterpreted as a microaggression or as a major aggression or faux pas everywhere. And if you watch my evergreen series, you'll see that that actually is the case in certain rooms. And then a black student talked about how he gets frustrated when white teachers make him, expose his frustration, and how even looking at white people is difficult sometimes when the tensions are really high with regards to racial incidents. And then he talks about his own learning times, about being a man, trying to talk to females about their experience with sexual harassment, and he doesn't know if it's his place to talk to them about that. And as a teacher, or as a man in authority, and they're always being submitted to bad men, is he replicating the bad men in their life? He takes a humble tact in that respect. He also talks about this incident where he was doing research on Hitler Youth and how they were groomed by the Nazis to be Nazis themselves, and how he found this book of fairy tales that was excellently constructed, and he exclaimed how beautiful this text was. And then a Jewish student called him out because the Jewish student's grandparents had perished during the Holocaust. So he brings up those examples to say that he's really thinking about these things. How do you have these really intimate, vulnerable conversations when there's all these houses and everybody belongs to their own groups, and there's all this pain and suffering and tension between the groups and within the different houses of the group? So I'm going to read this last part because I think it's really relevant to kind of expand and give him the benefit of the doubt of what he's trying to do with these vulnerable conversations. In tough times, minority communities often believe that we're all we've got, so we more thoroughly invest in each other's well-being. Our struggles directly and maybe even subconsciously influence the language we use with each other. This became mortifyingly clear during the more publicized police shootings, as I noticed black students leaving each other with a handshake and a reminder to stay safe. With this in mind, it should be easy to understand why minority students might prefer to discuss racial issues only within an intimate community of shared experiences. However, daily cultural exchange with students from different races has duped many teachers into assuming an intimacy that does not exist. We reason that since students from different backgrounds are comfortable discussing occasional racial topics with us, they are automatically eager to join us in unpacking their deepest racial anxieties, anger, and confusion. Yet there has always been a difference between collegial banter and house talk, between the water cooler and the dining room table. It is dangerous to invite ourselves to the latter, being the dining room table, because we are tolerated at the former, being the water cooler. We must, if we value our students' right to determine healthy relationships, never accept invitations unless they have been proffered. We must, through earnest humility, earn our seats. Seems like he's trying to get into a relationship with the student that is a familial relationship. And he's arguing, I think, in his Twitter thread that that is what he perceives and his colleagues perceive is their job to do with regards to gender, sexuality, and all these other aspects that are rather tenuous and filled with emotion, filled with trauma in the students' lives. To continue, we must, through earnest humility, earn our seats. Just as we cannot conjure safe spaces from midair, we should not expect the familial intimacy, vulnerability, and forgiveness needed for meaningful race conversations to emerge from traditional classroom relationships. Right? Key word there. Traditional classroom relationships aren't good enough, it seems to me, he's saying. To continue, to this point, we teachers have to honestly measure our classroom relationships. A good place to start is to reflect on our classroom's stated and implied priorities. Familial intimacy depends, so he really is arguing that that is what your job is to do as a teacher, is to overstep the bounds of a traditional classroom relationship, because familial intimacy depends on both parties feeling like a priority to the other. We do not tend to feel close to those who continually treat us like afterthoughts. To preserve our emotional well-being, healthy people draw specific parameters around these relationships, saving our vulnerability for those to whom we are the greatest priority. This extends to the classroom, where most students consider their teachers only tangentially invested in their lives beyond their academic performance. Traditional classroom conversations rarely trouble this perception, as most of the discourse is directly related to course content. Why would it be any way else? Notre Dame's former Vice President for Public Relations, James W. Frick, famously claimed, "Don't tell me what your priorities are. Tell me how you spend your money, and I'll tell you what they are." It is the same with a slight variation for teachers. A lot more time for a particular activity, and that is what students will think you value most. By this reasonable metric, students generally understand our course content to be the most important subject in the room. Again, why wouldn't that be the case? So while students may believe that we mean them no active harm and that we would generally prefer that they were happy, their personal lives rarely feel like a priority. This is problematic when it comes to discussions of race. I'm going to bracket it here, gender and sexuality as well, where teachers suddenly find themselves asking students to pry open their wounds, be honest about fears, hopes, and anger, and mine their own lives instead of assigned texts for source material. Under what circumstances is it all right for a teacher to mine the lives of a student for trauma and to open them up to their fears and hopes and angers with a group of their friends? Are you trained as a teacher of English, and that's what he is, he's a teacher of English, are you trained as a teacher of English to produce these sorts of psychodramas, group therapy sessions, and how do you assure that they don't devolve into struggle sessions? This is exactly what Evergreen attempted to do to itself. Turn every single instance of a learning environment into a trauma environment where all of these raw emotions are exposed, and then we mine our own lives instead of assigned text or source material. I don't think that is a good idea whatsoever unless this person is thoroughly trained, and furthermore, the students know what they're getting into and the parents know what they're getting into as well. So why would he feel defensive about parents suddenly realizing that their kid isn't learning about math or science or English, but is being asked to divulge their secrets of their sexuality and their gender and all of their frustrations around race? Not that those things don't have a place. Not that a kid in certain environments does need someone to talk to. I'm sure that is a definite concern. I do know that teachers are trained to report on abuse. I don't think that they're trained on indoctrinating students and going against the will of the parents and then having to contend with the parents on how to make their kids more vulnerable. So we have to back up a little bit. This is problematic when it comes to discussions of race, where teachers suddenly find themselves asking students to pry open wounds, be honest about their fears, hopes, and anger, and mine their own lives instead of assigned texts or source material. Teachers here break a tacit agreement to keep our class conversations detached. This paradigm can be changed, but only through the effort and practice of building genuine house talk relationships. We may not always be invited to engage in house talk, but our odds increase once we create an environment of humility and genuine interest in each other's lives and passions. This is the sort of real safe space I try to build in my classroom, a not so magical notion that has opened the door to rich and meaningful race conversations and deep, empathetic learning. Now, I don't think that this guy's a bad guy. I think he's running with some ideas that are terrible and horrible and wrong, even though they do have some possibility of doing good work in the world. But they do tear down the project of instilling knowledge and skill into the student. It's not about that knowledge and skill. It's about deep empathetic learning. It's about meaningful conversations or uncomfortable conversations. So I think he might be a good guy. I have some problems with this ideology, coming back down to that, what is it, dismantling? What did he call it? Destabilizing normativity, destabilizing a kid's racism, homophobia, or transphobia. I really heavily disagree with that. I heavily disagree with him trying to defend the classroom from parental oversight or from oversight at all. And why I do, and I try to give this guy the benefit of the doubt of being a nice guy, just trying to do what he thinks is the right thing, is that how do we know that this stuff isn't just leading to abuse? Why would you be making a kid vulnerable and getting into their personal life? And furthermore, he specifically calls out that he's not even worried about the race conversations. He's worried about the conversations around gender and sexuality, of destabilizing a kid's gender and sexuality norms. And he's defensive that the parents are going to come in there and say, what's going on here, guys? So I wanted to bring more nuance to the conversation. Maybe I did, maybe I didn't. But I do think that this is an example of what teachers think is their rights and their responsibilities with the students. And this is absolutely insane and wrong and absolutely against what we want the students to be learning. Actual skills, actual knowledge. Leave the empathetic conversations to family relationships and relationships outside of the school. Without your power dynamic of you being a teacher, no matter how humble you are, you're still the authority figure, still, pushing that conversation where you think it should go and molding the normativity as you think it should be molded. And is that your job? Who elected you to do that? Who signed up on this? And why would a parent not be upset if that turns out what is happening to their kid in the middle of an English class or a poetry class or something like that? I mean, that's exactly what happened to me. If you look at my last Evergreen episode 22, it's exactly what was happening. The teacher really wanted us to have meaningful, deep, empathetic conversations. It turned into a frickin' struggle session with the most egregious amounts of authoritative manipulation of individuals and glee at causing pain because it was just. I mean, so I wish Matthew R.K., who, again, is a professor at the Science Leadership Academy in Philadelphia, I hope he doesn't get in too much trouble for this stuff. I hope he does think about what people are saying and doesn't just chalk it up to abuse, being abused and dragged on the internet. This is some serious stuff. He better not be hiding behind the mob that came after him. I mean, I don't want him to go overboard with punishment or anything, but if this is what's happening in our public education schools, we totally need to divest from this stuff, or at least expose it for what it is and give the parents the freedom to deny the teachers meddling with their children in this way. Those are my thoughts. I hope you guys are doing good. I'll talk to you soon. Stay cool, calm, and collected. Good night.